Hello everyone! We are going to start this Unity tutorial where we'll create a dialogue system inspired by RPG and JRPG style games. Basically, when we get close to an NPC, we can left click to open the dialog box, which allows us to configure the character's name, dialogue line and the avatar. To follow along with the tutorial, I recommend downloading the resources I've prepared for you. There's a link in the video description. The first thing we're going to do is create our canvas so we can insert all the UI elements there. We will right-click and select Canvas. We'll configure this canvas in the Canvas Scaler component by setting it to scale with screen size. Here, we'll enter the resolution we are using in our game. So, what do we need to create inside this canvas? First, an empty game object with a rect transform, which will let us reposition the dialog box. Inside it, we'll add a text box for the dialogue, another one for the character's name, an image for the little icon that tells us to press enter to continue, and finally an image for the character's avatar. We are going to create our first element. Right-click on the canvas and choose Create Empty. We'll rename this object to the system. Inside this system, we'll right-click, go to UI Image, and with that image selected, we'll go to the image component. In Source Image, click the circle on the right, search for the system. Select the PNG image and apply it to using Set Native Size. Now we can scale it a bit to give it the shape we want. To make sure everything is centered, I'll select this image and place it in the middle. This way I have a better control over the exact position of each element. Now I'm going to rename this image to the System Dialog Box to keep everything well organized. I can duplicate it, this will be the System Name Box, and we are going to change its image source image as well. I have to adjust it. I'll come here and more or less make sure it's properly aligned. Finally, I will add the character's avatar image, so inside the Systems, right-click, go to UI Image and create the image. I will adjust it here, roughly matching the height the character image will have, and I will make sure the maskable option is enabled. Then we'll click the Add component and choose RecMask 2D. What this does is allow the image placed inside this object to be cropped. Now I'll rename this to Speaker Mask. Important, for the mask to work, the object containing the image must be placed inside the one that holds the mask. So right-click, go to UI Image. Here I'll select a picture of my character. In this case, I will hit Set Native Size and adjust it so it fits within the frame. Finally, let's rename this to Speaker Image, and for the Speaker Mask, the object with the image component, we're going to apply some transparency. This way, we clean up the background of our avatar. Once we have it, I'm going to stretch and enlarge the name box by dragging the blue handles, not the yellow ones, to avoid size inconsistencies with its container, and I will type in player. Let's center it using these alignment icons. I will set the color to black and increase the font size a bit, though not too much, just in case the character's name is longer. For the typography, click the circle next to Font Assets and select your font. In my case, I will use this one, which you can download from Google Fonts. It's called Forum. If you import a font and nothing shows up, it's because the new system isn't like Unity's old legacy version. It's not enough to just import your font in TTF format. You also need to convert it. It's really simple. Go to Window, Text Mesh Pro, Font Asset Creator. Select the font you want to convert, click on the Generate Font Atlas and save your file. We continue with our dialog text box. Right-click on Dialog Box, go to UI Text Mesh Pro. I will place it around here more or less. In the Text Mesh Pro component, we will change the vertex color. Not pure black, but something more grayish. Not much the color scheme of our dialog, we could even use a dark brown tone. I'll make the text a bit larger, like size 40 for example, and we'll place our test text here. And how big should this box be? We'll keep adjusting it as we go. Now we will add our icon that tells the player that they can press a key to continue. Right click, go to UI, Image, and in the Sprite section, select your icon, click Set Native Size and then reset it. I'll zoom in a bit so I can move it wherever I want. Don't forget to rename everything properly. It will keep things much better organized, much cleaner and easier to find later. Let's continue with the scripting part. I've created a folder called Scripts, and inside it I made another folder. Just right-click and choose Create Folder called Dialog System. We're going to open it and create a script. Right-click, go to Create C# Script and name it Dialog Line. In this first script, we're simply going to create a public class called Dialog Line. This will allow us to access these kinds of variables from other scripts. Let's clean up the top by removing all the extra using statements and leave only using Unity Engine. At the top of the class, we will add the system.serializable attribute. Why? Because it allows us to make this class visible in the Unity inspector. This way we will be able to work with it publicly, as we will see next. Inside the class, we will create a public string variable called speaker name, another public string called dialog text, and I will add the text area attribute to make it easier to write longer text. And finally, a public sprite called Speaker Portrait, which will be the avatar of the character speaking. The reason we added system.serializable is because it lets us use this class inside other scripts and see its variables in the inspector. That way, we can easily assign the speaker's name, dialog line, and icon for each person speaking. The next script we are going to create is the Dialog Manager. Right-click, go to Create C# Script and name it Dialog Manager. We're also going to create a game object called Dialog Manager, since this object will control the entire dialog system from any other script, whether we trigger it by clicking on an NPC or during a cutscene where we want dialogue to appear. Everything will reference this object. Right-click in the hierarchy, choose Create Empty, rename it Dialog Manager and drag the script onto it. For now, the script will be empty. At the top of our script, let's import the following libraries. Using UnityEngine.ui to access elements like image, using TMP Pro to manage our dialog text and character names, and using system.collections to work with coroutines. So what is a coroutine? Basically, it lets us run a sequence of events based on certain conditions. It's commonly used to execute one action, then wait a bit, then trigger another action. In our case, for example, display text, wait until the player presses space, then move to the next dialogue. Next, we are going to make our script a singleton. So what is a singleton? It's this declaration we're adding here. What we're doing is creating a public static variable of the same type as the class itself. This allows us to access it from anywhere without needing to manually link in the inspector or create a separate reference. We just use it directly, like this line of code where we call dialogmanager.instance. That instance is the singleton variable we defined in the Dialog Manager class. To make this work, we need to assign a value to the instance. We'll create an awake function, which, as you know, runs before start, and we'll add this condition. If instance is null, we assign this object to the variable. Otherwise, if instance is already assigned, we destroy the object. This ensures that we never have two Dialog Manager objects in the same scene. Now we're going to create the 4 essential variables we need to reference and control the dialog system. This will let us update both the text and the character image. We'll create a public TextMesh Pro UGuy variable for the name box, another TextMesh Pro UGuy for the dialog box, an image variable for the speaker's portrait, and finally a public game object for the dialog container itself. This will allow us to show or hide the entire dialog box in the scene. At this point, it's a good idea to go to the inspector, select the Dialog Manager and assign these references. So, text dialog will go in the dialog box, text name in the name box, speaker image in the character portrait, and dialog game object will be the parent object that contains everything. Next, we need to configure the speed at which the text is displayed. And finally, we'll declare 2 public pool variables to manage dialog states. IsTyping will help detect when text is currently being written, and dialog finished will tell us when we've completed the entire dialogue. We'll use this variable later inside the NPC Dialogue to reset the system and make sure the NPC can talk again without getting stuck. Here comes something important, the declaration of the class we created earlier. So we're going to write public dialog line, and this will turn it into an array. An array let us store a list of this type of variable. This will be an array of the class dialog line. We'll be able to click the plus icon in the inspector to add the different dialog lines we want for our scene. Now let's declare some private variables that won't be accessed from other scripts. First, an int variable to keep track of the current index of our dialog list. This index will tell us which line to load. For example, if it's index 0, it will load this avatar, this name, and this text. When the user finishes reading and presses the enter key, it will jump to index 1 and load the next dialog line. We'll also create a private coroutine variable to help manage the coroutine we talked about earlier. And finally, we'll add a private bool variable called justStart and we'll initialize it to false. This will help us fix a small bug that happens when calling the Dialog Manager from the NPC Dialogue. Let's move on the coroutine itself. Very important, coroutines start with the function type enumerator. We are going to call it typeLine, followed by parentheses. Inside the parentheses, we're going to use the dialog line variable we created earlier. We'll just call it line. Everything inside this coroutine will happen when we launch it. The first thing we'll do is set isTyping to true, because when this coroutine starts, it means our dialog line is beginning. Next, we'll access the textbox variable from our TMP component and set its .text to an empty string. That way, each time a new dialog line starts, the textbox resets and types the new sentence from scratch. Then, we'll access the namebox and set text to line.speakername. This step is very important. it tells the system to fetch the speaker name value from the specific line that's currently being used based on the index. In the same way, for the character image, we'll write speaker image.sprite equal line.speakerPortrait. So what we're doing here is assigning the values from the current dialog line to our existing variables, so they appear correctly on the screen. Now we'll write a for each loop. As with any loop, it will repeat until it finishes. What are we going to do? We will write for each char C in line.dialog text, which means for each character C in our dialog text, we'll add that character one by one to the dialog text box, so the player sees the sentence being brightened letter by letter. A for each loop will go through all the characters in our dialog line. If we have 60 characters, it will add each one of them to the dialog box. And we'll end that with a yield return you'd wait 4 seconds typing speed. This is the variable we declared earlier, which has a speed value. What this does is wait for that amount of time before writing the next character. So every time a character is added, the coroutine says, wait this long, now write the next one. When the for each finishes, we set isTyping to false because the loop has completed writing the entire line of text. Now let's move on to another function called showFullLine. This function will instantly display the entire line of dialogue. Why are we doing this? Because in most games, if you notice, while the text is being brightened out, some players, like me for example, are too impatient to wait for the whole line to finish, so when we press a certain key, the system will skip the typing effect and show the full line immediately. Now I'll explain the start dialog function, because this is the one we call in this case from the NPC Dialogue script. That's why we are going to make this function public and call it start dialog. Inside, we're going to create an array type variable called newLines. Why are we doing this? Because all the dialog lines will be contained inside the NPC Dialogue script. That script will send the file list. That's why we need to declare a variable to receive those lines as an array. Since our dialog system starts deactivated, what we'll do now is access the dialog game object we previously created and activated. At this point, because the line of dialog is about to start, we need to make sure the variable dialog finished is set to false. Next, we assign the dialog lines variable, the array we created earlier, with the new lines coming from the NPC. And since every dialog should always start with the first line, we'll set the index to 0. To solve a small bug, basically a short delay between the NPC's click and the moment the dialog starts writing, we'll set the justStart variable to true. And finally, we'll assign the typing coroutine variable by starting the coroutine type line pacing in the current dialog line using the index. This way, every time a new dialog line starts, the correct one is brightened on screen, character by character. My first line will be index 0, so my first dialog will start at 0, but when we finish that dialog, which we'll handle next, we'll increase the index. So on the next call, dialog line number 1 will be displayed, and it will continue like that. Remember that always arrays start at 0. To finish this script, we'll go to the update method. First, we'll open a conditional if statement. Inside, we'll check for two input buttons. This means the condition will trigger if either one is pressed, the spacebar or the left mouse button. Inside that, we'll open another conditional. If you remember, we had created a variable called justStart. This tiny step will help you avoid a bug that sometimes appears when the NPC dialog calls the dialog manager. Below that, we'll add another conditional to check if we're currently typing. The logic here is simple. If we are typing and we press the spacebar or the left mouse button, we're telling the system, hey, stop the coroutine and show the phone line immediately. When that happens, we'll set is typing to false. But what happens when is typing is already false? That's what we'll handle next. The thing we are going to do is increase our index. Now we'll open another conditional, and this one is simple. If my current index is less than the total number of dialog lines, for example, if I have written 3 lines and my index is 1, since 1 is less than 3, the next coroutine will be executed. But if my current index is greater than or equal to the total number of lines, then that means there are no more dialog lines to display. So we need to tell Unity, hey, if you go past the number of lines my NPC has, what we're going to do is clear out the 3 main components. That means mtime the speaker number, the dialog box, and the avatar image. We'll also set the dialog finished variable to true because that's what tells the NPC it can run the dialog again if needed. Finally, we'll deactivate the dialog manager object so that it's no longer visible on screen. Now let's create the dialog NPC script. As always, right-click, create C# script, name it dialog NPC. Why do we create this script? Because we want to centralize the way an NPC triggers dialog. This gives us flexibility in case we want to use different methods. For example, if we're running a cutscene, we may create a different script like cinematic dialogue to control it. Let's now assign this script to our NPC object. I've created a simple scene here with a character for testing. This NPC has a circle collider, which will handle the event to detect whether we're colliding with the player or not. As you can see, my player already has the player tag assigned and the dialog script attached. Inside the dialog script, let's clean up the top and leave only the using Unity Engine library. Now let's create our variables. First, we'll declare a public dialog line, an array. Why an array? Because this way we can chain multiple dialog lines. Each line will be passed to the dialog manager and displayed in order, just like we set it up earlier. All of this needs to be connected. Below that, we'll declare a private boolean that will help us check if the player is within range of the NPC. This is important to make sure that dialog only starts when the player is nearby, not just by clicking randomly and accidentally triggering NPC dialog. And finally, we'll declare a public boolean called dialog start. This acts as a kind of switch to make sure the dialog doesn't restart every time we press the interaction key. Now for the trigger detection, it's very simple. Make sure your collider is set as trigger, and then we'll write the event function for when our trigger detects collisions. We are going to check whether the object we're colliding with has the player tag. Remember, this kind of check climbs up from the collision component, like a box collider to the object it's attached to and then checks that object's tag. Since we've set the player tag and our character, when the player enters the trigger zone, we'll set the player in range variable to true. On the other hand, in the onTriggerExit method, if we exit a trigger with an object tag player, we'll set player in range back to false. Now let's go into the update function and write a conditional. This conditional allows us to check if we're near the NPC and pressing one of the keys that activate the dialogue. So we check if player in range is true, that means we're near the NPC, and if dialogue start is false, that means we are not already in a dialogue. Then, and only then, we'll allow the dialogue to begin. We also add one more important condition, and this condition is grouped using parentheses. What we are doing here is checking if the player presses either the spacebar or the left mouse button. Both inputs will work. Again, grouping the conditions correctly is important. When this happens, we call the dialog manager.instance. If you remember, this is the singleton we created, so we can access it without needing to declare a public variable for the dialog manager, or link it manually in the inspector. We simply call the object directly. It is super convenient. Then we activate its public start dialog function, and we pass in the array of dialog lines with writing on the NPC. Once we've done that, we set the dialog start variable to true. This prevents the condition from being triggered again while the dialog box is already being shown. And finally, the last condition is necessary because if we look at the overall logic of this system, that dialog start flag will otherwise stay true permanently. We need this to deactivate again, so we talk again to the NPC, in case we want the player to be able to talk to them multiple times, unless, of course, you want a system where they only talk to you once and that's it, but that's usually not the case. So we're going to open a condition where we check if this is true, meaning the dialog start variable is active, which it will be when the dialog begins, and the dialog finished variable is also true. This is the variable we created earlier to track the state of the conversation. When both are true, then we simply set the dialog start to false, because if the dialog has started and already finished, it means we've reached the end of that dialog sequence. So it's time to reset this variable. Now let's go to our NPC and add the NPC Dialogue script. And here is where we'll start writing the dialogue lines. But before doing that, I strongly recommend making sure everything is linked and properly configured. Before all that, I'm going to scroll down and position this at the bottom. In the scene view, I press the F key to center on it and I'll move it downward. Now we are going to write our NPC's dialogue lines. With the dialog component added here, we can click the plus icon to add as many lines as we need. Once we've written our dialog lines, let's test it. As both characters are in contact, if I click the left mouse button, the first dialog line appears. If I click again, the next line pops up. As you can see, the text is typing out character by character. We also brought a line of code for a function that displays the full line at once, so while it's still typing out the text, if I click left, it instantly shows the complete line. There are a few improvements we could make to this dialog system. For example, we could make the icon blink, add a visual indicator above the speaking character, or even reposition the dialog box to the top or center of the screen, like in RPG Maker. And that wraps our dialog system tutorial. I hope you enjoyed. For more videos, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you have any feedback, questions, or run into any issues, feel free to drop a comment below. Thanks again, see you in the next one.